So thanks for coming, welcome. My aim is to leave some time at the end so that we can discuss and exchange, because I know that I presented another study yesterday. And there are lots of parallels, but there are also lots of differences between where I'm from in Quebec and what's going on here in Scotland. And Nora's presentation was really great, wasn't it? So the title of this presentation is Counternarratives of Transition in Marginalized Neighbourhoods, Listening to Mothers, Early Childhood Educators, and Kindergarten Teachers. It was my PhD thesis, which I finished about a year ago. So I'm going to start by presenting the context of early childhood education and care in Quebec, and then we'll go through the research study. So in Canada, education and childcare are under provincial jurisdiction, so there's huge differences between provinces. Very few federal laws. I think the only federal law that pertains to education is that you need to offer schooling in both English and French. And at some point it was also religious, Protestant Catholic. But so we're going to look at Quebec, because that's where I am. And we have a split system, but it doesn't split at 3, it splits at 5. And it's an overlapping split system, which I will explain to you. So early childhood education in Quebec, it was the first subsidized and regulated childcare system in North America, designed to be universal, but there's only enough spaces for about 60% of the children. So children from birth to age 5 on September 30th, when they're eligible for 5-year-old kindergarten. The childcare program was put into place in 1997. It started off, it's very accessible, affordable. So it started off as $5 a day. It went up to $7 a day. Now it's sliding scale based on income, but just to compare, the numbers don't matter, but if you go next door to Ontario, the average family will pay $75 a day for daycare because it's all private. And there are very, very few subsidized spaces based on income and need, whereas this is for everyone, maximum 21, and there are tax rebates and stuff. It's governed by the Ministry of Family, and there are 3 types of regulated and subsidized care. The most popular, and the one that typically rates the highest with regards to quality, are what we call the Centres de la Petite Enfance, CPEs, early childhood centers. There's also subsidized private daycare centers, for-profit, and home childcare, which are regulated, coordinated by coordinating bureaus affiliated with an early childhood center. And the practitioners in the early childhood sector are, they're called educators, early childhood educators, and they have a 3-year college pre-university diploma. And the centers kind of look like this. Very few of them are actually in purpose-built buildings. Often they're in renovated parts of a church or part of a school or part of a storefront. But you can see the proximity. They're part of the neighborhood. They're accessible to parents. And then we have the school, the primary school system. It's part of the public school system, which is for children ages 4 to 12. And it's divided into preschool and primary. So preschool is 4-year-old kindergarten and 5-year-old kindergarten. And it's not compulsory. 4-year-old kindergarten is a new program that started out only for full-time, full-day. 4-year-old kindergarten started out only for children in what they call disadvantaged neighborhoods. And now they're trying to roll it out for everyone, but there's still groups of 4- and 5-year-olds in the childcare centers, so that's a bit of a political conflict at the moment that I'd love to chat with you about later. Most children, the vast majority, start school at age 5. 98% of them attend, so because it's not mandatory. There's also school-based childcare, which is subsidized with the same fee structure as the early childhood services, so before, after school, and lunch care. And then the teachers are actually trained. There's no separate education for preschool or kindergarten teachers. They have the same training as primary school teachers, so they're trained to teach children ages 4 to 12. It's a 4-year bachelor's degree. And the schools kind of look like that, fenced, big, imposing. Some recent history that I'm not going to go through, but minor changes to the structure. And so we have a research project. Starts with a problem. There's a dominant paradigm in early childhood I'm sure you're familiar with this, the idea that early childhood education is an investment. We're all about the future. We have to put the money in now because that way we'll save money on school leaving, on the criminal justice system. So it's all about preventative and preparing the children for the future. Not just the future level of school, but so that they can become productive global economic citizens. And in this paradigm, we have this deficit-oriented compensatory approach regarding children from disadvantaged neighborhoods. So children who live in poverty have more difficult transitions. Their parents are less engaged. We have all this research, and the media takes it up. In Quebec, we had a huge population study. Actually, they repeat it every 3 years now, on basically child development in kindergarten or school readiness. It's the EDI instrument. It's an early development index. They use it in Australia too. And so the kindergarten teacher fills out a checklist and measures children's development. And then they find that 1 in 3 children are vulnerable at school start. So there's this huge discourse in the media about how children are getting to school and they're not ready. And then we have laws and official documents, which also targets children and families living in poverty. For the childcare setting, we have the Childcare Act. And article number 1 is the whole point of our childcare system is to level the playing field, especially for kids living in poverty and children identified as having special needs. So we're already targeting, even though we have this universal program, and we know that transition practices are used to establish positive relationships between teachers and families. I'm going to show you one called Moving On to School that is being used in Quebec. But all of this discourse and this idea that children need to be prepared for school, specifically when they live in what I call marginalized neighborhoods because of this deficit-oriented approach, the way that we look at the neighborhood, and we assume that the parents who live in these neighborhoods are not capable of preparing their kids for school like the other normal parents would be. So we don't really know what the parents in these neighborhoods think and how that discourse influences their children's transitions, their relationships with the educators and then the teachers when their children start school. And there's also, at the time when I did the study, there's a lot of research on transition, but a lot less on what the early childhood educators' perspectives were. A lot of the research was just with the first year of school teachers who were talking about receiving the children, but not what was happening before. The Moving On to School document and process. The document, and this is one of many that we have in Quebec, this idea of basically like a childcare report card, where the educator will observe the child with a developmental checklist and check off how they're doing, and then give it to the parent, and the parent takes it to the school. And there's a process put into place, which was a little bit similar to, I think it was Nora this morning, who said that some very, very rarely do educators and teachers get to sit down at the same table and talk. So the process around this is very interesting because the training for it involves the kindergarten teachers and the early childhood educators who get to sit and share what they do. So that's a really nice thing, but I was curious about how this document also was used and how that contributed to children's transitions and their parents' relationships with the school and the childcare center during the transition. So the research questions were how do parents, and you'll notice it's not mothers, my goal was parents, early childhood educators and kindergarten teachers narrate their experiences regarding their relationships during the transition to school, and how do these narratives support and contest meta-narratives of deficiency, school readiness, and pedagogicalization, which I will explain to you what those strange words mean. So I'm coming from a reconceptualist, social justice critical view of early childhood education and a post-colonial approach to knowledge legitimacy. So what frustrated me as a practitioner before I started the PhD was that things I said, because they didn't come from research and they weren't scientific, nobody was going to listen to them. And when I told my experiences of working with parents, or my experience as a parent, it was not valued. So when I did this, I said, I want the parents to be heard, and I want the educators to be heard, and I want the teachers to be heard. And so that's why we're looking at their narratives through a postmodern narrative framework where the narratives are not necessarily the truth. They're not a reflection of this is what happened, but how they construct their reality and how they construct their identity through telling these stories. So a few definitions. Meta-narratives are like grand discourses that circulate in a society. So this idea that children in marginalized neighborhoods need to be prepared for school, but other children don't, that would be a meta-narrative. And within that, there are general cultural expectations for the parents, for the educators, for the teachers, for the children. Counternarratives is when somebody telling their own story contests this meta-narrative, but they don't always do it up front directly, because these meta-narratives are so embedded in the way that we think that if we challenge them, it's almost like people don't understand us. So if a parent were to say, I don't want my child to do well in school, people would be like, what? It's hard to hear and it's hard to understand. So the counter-narratives often will use different strategies to either say, well, I know it's like that, but I'm different, or my experience doesn't really match with that, or here's another way of looking at it, some additional information. And so the meta-narratives that I was particularly interested in was this idea of marginalization, so the deficit-oriented thinking of families living in poverty. This readiness, so the idea of school readiness, as opposed to looking at transition, and like we saw the ready child, but really that discourse of having to prepare the children. And then the idea of pedagogicalization of parents, which is when the parent's role gets defined as what the school expects of them. So the parent doing what the school asked is considered way more important than whatever the parent decides is important. So the parent might really want to pass on their passion for piano, and they might spend hours teaching the child piano, and they might have this wonderful time and relationship. But if the parent's not signing that form that comes from the school and not attending the meetings and not passing on this positive attitude about school, then they're going to be looked down upon and they're going to be seen as not being a good parent. So the general objective was to understand parents, early childhood educators, and kindergarten teachers' perspective regarding their relationships during the transition to kindergarten in marginalized neighborhoods, and how their narratives support and contest the deficiency, readiness, and pedagogicalization meta-narratives. And the specific objectives were to assemble multi-voice narratives of the transition to kindergarten. So the same child, the parent, one parent, the early childhood educator, and the teacher of the same child, and how all those people discussed it, because there's a lot of research that looks at parent perspectives and teacher perspectives and educator perspectives, but often it'll be focus groups. So the parents said this, and then the teachers said that, and look, they don't match, but I really wanted to look at one child, what are they saying, and where does it not match, and why? I wanted to interpret the narratives individually to summarize what the parents say about the children's transitions and the relationships between educators, teachers, and parents, and identify the meta-narratives, general cultural expectations, and counter-narratives in these assembled narratives. So it's a narrative longitudinal multi-case study over the course of a year, starting in February when the parents signed up their children for kindergarten, so in the last year of childcare, and then ending in December, so not quite a year, or January actually, for some of the teachers, once the children were in kindergarten. And I wanted whichever parent was more involved with the childcare center, and it was only mothers who agreed to participate. So I have 2 boys and 2 girls, and one of the girls, it was actually her dad who was way more involved because the mom worked full-time and was studying full-time, and it was still the mother who insisted on participating. And so that's a limitation of the study, but it kind of reflects most research on relationships with families, where we saw yesterday a study with 83% mothers, the big survey in Malta. So it's hard. It's a struggle, this access to fathers, that I'm still working on. So the children attended 3 different early childhood centers in 3 different neighborhoods, and then they went off to 4 schools and 3 different school boards. So I followed them over that transition. And they needed to be, the recruitment criteria were the neighborhoods were classified through that study on school readiness as being at risk for too many vulnerable children in these neighborhoods. And then the family also had to be perceived as disadvantaged or marginalized by the early childhood center, the educator or the director or the pedagogical coordinator who helped me recruit. Because it's this concept is very subjective. And research has shown that you can't just say, okay, you fit these criteria, so you're a marginalized parent or you're a disadvantaged parent, but it's really about the way that we see and how we see this difference between, distance between the parent and the institution. And I also wanted the oldest child in the family because for parents, it's the first child, their transition that's really the most, that marks them the most. So the study was conducted from 2014 to 2015, and there were individual narrative interviews that were audio recorded and then painstakingly transcribed with the mothers 4 times, and then twice with the educators and twice with the teachers, and also communication documents. So in the childcare center, there was that moving on to school document, and there was also a communication agenda that the parents, I don't know if you have these here, but at the end of the day, the educator will write something about the child's day, and then the mother will look at it and possibly write or just read, how many hours did my child sleep, what did they play, did they have a good day? And then in the school, we had 2 report cards. So there was a preliminary report card in October, and then the first official report card in November. And also there was this communication agenda, which took different forms in the kindergartens. So there are three sets of analysis, just assembling the multi-voice narratives, which I'll present really, really briefly to you, then interpreting them individually and what I call intra-case and inter-case, and then looking at the 3 different meta-narratives and whether they were supported or contested. So we have assembled narratives for 4 children. This is like 60 pages of transcription condensed into 20 pages in a thesis document and now presented for you as 1 slide. So there's lots that's excluded, but Daniel's mom had an excellent relationship with the early childhood educator because she worked at the center as an unqualified replacement educator. She was young, she was in her early 20s, and he actually had a twin sister who was in a different group than him, but also at the same childcare center. And the mother really positioned herself as, I have a great relationship with the educator. I go up to her, I'm available, and they worked together. They had some really lovely exchanges because Daniel was a little bit aggressive. He had a few social emotional issues, and they would come up with solutions together. And the mother would do things at home, but the teacher also at one point, they decided that it would be good for him to go to karate. And then the teacher set up her room as a karate dojo, and he taught karate to the other kids, and they got to play. So there was this very nice back and forth. And the mother, she said, oh yeah, when I go to school, it's going to be the same because I'm open and I communicate and I take initiative. And then he did really well when he started school. There was no problem. Actually, the teacher described him as in much more positive terms than the educator. The educator talked about his strengths, but also his challenges. The teacher was like, oh, he's great. But the mother had a really hard time. She said she felt insecure. She didn't know what was going on. There wasn't enough communication for her. And the teacher had no idea. The teacher thought everything was great. She was very happy because the mom signed the agenda every day. She came to the meetings. So there was this dissonance. Then we have Emma, who started childcare. Most children start childcare between 1 and 2 in Quebec, but Emma didn't start until she was 4, or just about to turn 4. So she was only there for 1 year. And her and her younger sister started at the same time. And as soon as they started, the mom found out that her daughters had a speech-language delay, both of them. And so this was a huge part of her adaptation to childcare. And she talked about how she prepared her kids for childcare. She took them to the library and she made a routine. And so just starting the childcare was a big transition for her. And then it was a really emotional experience because while she loved the educator, she was really concerned about her daughter's language development. And she put off going to the meetings with this. There was a speech therapist from the local clinic who came to meet with them at the childcare center. And so she would describe herself both as being really proactive, and she didn't wait for the childcare. She went to make an appointment right away. But at the same time, she kept putting off the appointment at the childcare center. She didn't feel comfortable. And then they were really supportive at the childcare center, and they said, you're the mom, you take your time when you're ready. And finally, she started that process. And by the end of the year, before her child started school, the speech delay had been resolved. So kind of like what we heard yesterday, she was a special needs child, and then she wasn't anymore. And her transition went really well. The teacher loved her. And the teacher was a bit of was a bit dichotomous because a bit of a perplexing paradox, because she both would say things like, this child is fantastic. And the mom, I should say, was a single mom who the dad was sort of in the picture sometimes, but not that often. And she positioned herself really as the single mom in charge of these two kids. And the teacher, because the dad would pick up the daughter twice a week and would sign the agenda, thought that the parents were a couple. So she went on and on about how Emma didn't come from an exploded family and how this was so rare and so wonderful to see both parents involved. So there was this judgment of all the other children, but not of this one. And at the same time, this teacher, yesterday we were talking about people who, even within systems, how teachers can, even if the system has constraints and doesn't make it easy for teachers to establish relationships with families, teachers can still go beyond. And this teacher actually did. And in Montreal gets a lot colder than Glasgow. So in minus 40-degree weather, every day this teacher would put on her boots, she would put on her coat, and she would go outside, because the practice is this, in the childcare center, the parents come in, they can come into the room, they talk every morning, they talk every evening, they help the child take off their coat. And once they start school, they have to stand behind the fence. And if they come pick up their child, if their child goes to after-school childcare, they go in and there's a person with a walkie-talkie who sends the child. So it's very, very separate. But this teacher actually would put on her coat and her hat and her boots and her scarf and go outside every day just to be accessible to the parents, at least the parents who were able to come and pick up their children at 3 o'clock. So the mom and the teacher had a great relationship, except the teacher didn't really know about the fact that they were split up. And the mother put her child into the school childcare service, and then she felt like it wasn't really safe or secure enough for her daughter, so she pulled her out after a few days. And she was very she wanted to complain about it, but didn't, and really questioned. She kept telling me how she was going to complain, and she was going to take it to the ombudsman, and she was going to do all this stuff, and then it didn't happen. Then we have Thomas, who was identified as having a motor delay, a fine motor delay, before he started childcare or right at the beginning. So there's a process with an occupational therapist and a specialized educator at the childcare center. And the mom meets regularly with the educator, the specialized educator, the occupational therapist, and he's got like an individualized development plan. But the mother is described as insecure and difficult. So there's complaints. This mother, she's very demanding. She wants her child's food separated. She doesn't want him to do as many arts and crafts projects because he has difficulty with fine motor skills. And she complains also about the educator, and she liked the last year's educator better. So this is a difficult relationship with the childcare center for this mom, who broke up with the dad in the middle of the study. And when she gets to the school, she realized actually the childcare center wasn't so bad. She says that he doesn't want to go to school, her son. The teacher says he has difficulty with learning and behavior. And the teacher complains also, says that the parent is insecure, she asks me questions, I write things in the agenda, or she writes things in the agenda, but then she has to tell me orally, and this is considered something negative, that she's trying to talk to the teacher in the mornings. But then they go on a field trip, and the mother volunteers, and it gives the teacher a chance to get to know the mother and realize actually the mother had a really hard time when she was in school, and so instead of questioning the way things work for all the parents, she says, okay, I'm going to invite this parent in to come and do a cooking workshop. So she's allowed in, but the rest of them aren't because she needs it, but they don't. And then there's a problem because the parent complains. So the parents have to wait outside in the freezing cold at 11:27 for if their child goes home for lunch, and 3:07, for example, and they have to get to school by 8:07, or their child is late and they're seen as a bad parent. So if they're not there at 8:07, it's a problem. So she gets there at 3:07 every afternoon, and sometimes the teacher brings the kids out at 3:09 or 3:15 or 3:20 because they're little and they have trouble buttoning up their coats and they have to walk down the stairs, and the parent thinks this is unfair. So she complains to the principal, and then the teacher gets really upset, and basically they stop talking to each other for a few months, and then they have to fix the problem. But so she's really seen as a difficult parent in both situations. And then we have Alice, this is the mom where it's mostly the dad it's actually the dad and an older cousin who pick her up from the childcare center, and a grandma. The mom works full-time and is in school full-time. And so the early childhood educator doesn't really have a relationship with the parents. She doesn't see them, and when she does, she finds them very shy. They don't really open up. And she says it's okay because she doesn't have any problems. So this is, I heard this from other teachers, but not other early childhood educators, this idea that communication is only in the case of a problem. But for this educator, she didn't need to communicate because there weren't any serious problems, but she did describe Alice as a child who tattletales, so who tells on the other kids. And then as soon as she starts school, both her mother and the teacher describe her as the perfect student. She's a leader, she learns quickly, she plays well, everything is perfect, and she likes school. And during the course of the study, so until December, according to the teacher, the mother has never met the mom. And it's actually a really nice story because the dad went to the same school, and the mother had the aunt, and she remembered this family, and she said they really they lived in it was a neglectful family, and it was really difficult. And so she was so touched to see this man come in with his daughter, and that the daughter's doing so well. And so it was this nice intergenerational story. But she said she never met the mom. And when I spoke to the mom said, oh yeah, I went to the parent-teacher interview, and this is what they said. And the teacher said, no, it was just the dad and the daughter who came. So that was interesting. So within each case, I looked at how the child was constructed. And in a number of situations, we had a vision of the child divided up into developmental domains with, okay, he's strong in cognitive skills, but he's got some trouble with social emotional skills, and her language is weak. She needs to learn how to stand up for herself more, but gross motor, she's doing great. So we had this vision of the child, and a lot of talk about readiness for school, specifically related to that document. So when we got the document, I saw that she didn't know how to tie her shoes. I saw that she didn't know how to count. And it oriented what the educators and the parents were going to work on over the summer to prepare the child for school. Once they got to school, they were pretty much, and I didn't mention this, but in the childcare center, at this age, it's a 1-to-10 ratio, whereas in school, it's 1-to-20. So in the school, it was like, either they adapt well, they follow the routine, they didn't cry, or they're in difficulty. And it was only 1 out of the 4 kids who was considered in difficulty because it didn't work. And the other children, there was no nuance. There was no, okay, this is what they're good at, this is what they're not. It was, they're great or they're not. And you could see the way that the evaluation documents, so like I said, the moving on to school documents, but also the report cards would basically, is there anything to worry about? That's what they wanted to know in school. Also communicate how the mothers were constructed. So really, the mothers really talked about transition as a time of loss. They lost their confidence. They lost their role, the relationship that they had in the CPE. And this was really difficult. They lost the ability to communicate and know what was going on for their child during the day, and they felt like they were losing their baby. So there was this process of mourning as their child was growing up. And in terms of communication, they had daily conversations in the childcare center, whereas the school had all passed written through the agenda. And when you just examine the documents, in the childcare agenda, it was mostly the educator who wrote, whereas the school documents, it was the parent. There was a back and forth. The parents would use the document to inform. So you would think, oh, this is reciprocal, but the parents didn't like it. They didn't feel the need so much to tell. They wanted to hear the information. And they really missed the face-to-face communication. And then there were other things that stood out amongst the cases. The idea that the teachers, we think of the teacher, you're with a child for 10 months, but actually there was this idea that, of course, they have siblings, so they're going to come to the same class, and there's going to be this long-term relationship with the family. There was a lot of discussion about how they chose schools, and the way it works specifically in the city of Montreal is that you can go to your local neighborhood school, but you don't have to. And there are lots of extra programs that you could go to, like the alternative school or the sports program or the international program. But these parents, for the most part, except for Emma's mom, were not aware that they had this right. They thought, well, I just have to go to the one that's the closest to my school, to my home. The lack of communication with the school. The parental expectations of collaboration seem to be really based on their experiences in childcare, because the three parents who had good, close relationships in childcare were really upset when their children started school, whereas the parent who had no contact with the childcare and had no contact with the school, she was fine, she didn't mind. There were also multiple transitions in the children's lives. So a number of them, the school that they told me they were going to was not the same school that they ended up going to, because they were of a move or because the mother changed her mind or whatever. And there was the breakup of at least one family and others who moved house. The parental support networks, because they didn't have that communication with the educator, we were talking yesterday about how the educator has this role of support in helping the parent solve problems and think through discipline strategies or just let them know that they're okay and their child's okay. And then all of a sudden they're left on their own once they start school. But actually, it was the parents behind the fence who served this purpose. So as they were waiting for their children, they would chat and talk, and the parents who had older children already in the school would explain how things work. And that was really a source of reassurance for the parents. And both the parents and the early childhood educators, not so much the teachers, were very interested in the children's point of view and really saw. Yesterday, I think Ally and Wendy talked about transition readiness as opposed to school readiness, so really looking at how the child feels. And there was this idea that to make sure that that the child felt excited to go to school, that the child wasn't worried. And so both the educators and the mothers, they took the children to the playground, the school playground over the summer to get used to it. They thought about how they were going to support their children and make sure that the children felt, like we said yesterday, suitable at school. And then if we look at the three different meta-narratives, this idea of deficiency, the assumption that children from low-income neighborhoods are disadvantaged or at risk. It came up less than I thought it would in the narratives, but when it came up, it happened at registration. So when the mothers decided to send their children to the childcare center in this neighborhood where they lived, they were worried about who the other parents would be and who the other children would be. And the same thing when they started school. They wanted to know, well, I'm in a disadvantaged neighborhood, so who are these parents? I need to know that my kid is going to be okay. And who are these other kids, and are they going to behave properly? The educators mostly the educators more than the teachers, had this desire to help families. So this idea that the mom who's on welfare or social assistance, well, she needs to get a job, and she needs to, and a single mom too, a young single mom. So she needs to get a job, she needs to go out. So I'm gonna talk to her about this. And the educators mentioned this, but the parents didn't. So I don't know how the mothers experienced this desire to help, whether it was seen as intrusive or helpful. And there was a lot of judgment when the families who were split up, both from the teacher, like I explained, but also Daniel's parents, where he would spend 1 week with the mom and 1 week with the dad. And the educator was really worried because the children, the two twins, the parents didn't really talk to each other. And so she was worried about what impact that would have on the children once they started school. The teacher wasn't worried at all. Everything was fine. So, and also there was, it was mostly in terms of single motherhood, this idea of normative, whether single or families that were split up. And so there were some counter-narratives, including Thomas's mom, who presented herself as this exception to the rule. So here she's talking about when deciding to sign her child up for childcare. And she said, I don't want to judge, but I don't want him stuck with behavior problems or parents who aren't. I'm not rich, but I'm on welfare, but I still take care of my son. I don't do nothing at home. So she obviously accepted this narrative that welfare mothers are neglectful. But she's a welfare mother, but she's not like that. But she's still worried about sending her child to a child care center with other kids whose parents are on welfare. So there was the idea that the teacher, when she invites actually the same mom to help in class, she does it because she sees that the parent feels anxious. So there was never any, she was judged individually based on her being, they called her insecure, but nobody said it was because she was on welfare or because she didn't have a job. And I found the idea of this intergenerational community link, like this teacher who had the father and then had the daughter, was actually this idea of the school as this community that stays in the community, and the parents stay in the community, and I found that actually quite a powerful counter-narrative. So in terms of school readiness, the idea that we need to prepare the children for school and that when they come, they're in this worrisome state. There was a lot of talk about both preparing children for childcare, so the mother who talked about taking her children to the library and reading to them, and also preparing them for kindergarten, specifically, like I said, with the document. Okay, she needs to learn how to tie her shoes, she needs to learn how to alternate her feet when going up and down the stairs. We're going to work on that over the summer, so she'll be ready. And then once they started kindergarten, they no longer talked about whether or not kids were ready or they had arrived ready or not. So it was like this judgment that happened only before. But right away, the teachers and the parents started talking about preparing them for grade 1. So we're always focused on the future and we never enjoy the moment. There were institutional transition practices, like a teacher who came to the child care center and answered all the parents' questions. There were visits. The child care center would organize visits with the children to the closest school. But there were also parental transition practices, like I said. So taking the children to the school playground, going to community, parents attending community outside the school events, talking about kindergarten and starting school. And then really that moving on to school document was an evaluation of children's readiness. That's how it was. That might not be how it's presented on the website and by the people who are sharing it, but that's how it's seen. And it's really, and the kindergarten teachers, it's a 10-page document. It's long. They get one for most of the children in their class, and it doesn't tell them anything special. It doesn't help them learn, what are this child's strengths, his interests. It doesn't provide any useful information, except they look at them really quickly and they put them into 2 piles. doing okay, and oh, these are my problem children. And then they make sure that they divide the problem children amongst all the kindergarten classes to make everything equal for them so that nobody has a more difficult year than anyone else. The counter-narrative, though, is that when they talk about transition, especially the teachers, it's whether or not the children's crying. So a child who's crying is having a difficult transition, so we're not judging them or evaluating their skills. We're looking at their well-being and how they feel. Both the educational program in the childcare center and the one in the kindergarten they're these beautiful play-based documents that talk about each child being unique and focusing on meeting each child's individual needs and looking at relationships. And one of the educators, Thomas's educator, said that the mom was actually worried when he started schools, when he was about to start school, the child with the fine motor problems, because she wanted him to be able to write his name and form letters properly. And she said, she basically quoted from without saying that she was quoting from the early childhood curriculum document, she said, all children are unique. His learning has to be led by him, and so she used that as a counter-narrative to explain to the mother why she wasn't teaching him how to form his letters. And the transition practices actually were not so much about readiness. They were more about informing and reassuring parents and children. There were other practices with the children in one of the childcare centers where they had what they called an activity project. I don't know how to translate that, but basically they talked about school, and they did this project over from January to June, and it was a subtext just to give the children an opportunity to ask questions and share their concerns. And then this idea of pedagogicalization, so parents as substitute teachers who apply educational principles and adopt pedagogical behaviors to support the institutions and be recognized as good parents of students. So when we saw, the parents would tell me that they would, in order to prepare their children for school, they would repeat the activities that the children had done in childcare. So they're drawing triangles in the childcare, we're gonna draw triangles at home. They're singing songs, we're gonna sing the same songs. We're gonna make sure we have the same equipment, the scissors and the paintbrush and the markers. And there's this requirement that parents show a positive attitude towards school, and that if the parent is upset about something, that they don't share that or show that in front of the children. So both the mothers and the teachers mentioned this, that it was, I'm gonna cry the first day of school, but I'm not gonna let my child see. Or we had this argument, and I was really worried because the teacher who stopped talking to the parent, and I was worried that it would change the child's attitude, but I saw when she brought the child to school that she still was enthusiastic about him coming to school. So there's this obligation to support the school. And in terms of the kindergarten teachers, there was this very important not to have communication with the parents, but that the parents understood and respected the school rules. At school it works this way. If you're gonna be absent, you need to call the secretary. Don't write it in the agenda. You need to inform you have to call both the secretary and the after school, before school, lunchtime care people separately, and this is what you have to do, and you just have to learn that. You have to learn how to use the agenda. And even the parents would talk about how they had to learn how to follow the school rules. And the problems were really individualized. Like I said about the mother who had difficulty, nobody stood back and said, oh, all these mothers who are not complaining, maybe there was no awareness on the part of the school of how much the parents were having a hard time. And when one parent did show that she was having a hard time, it was just an individual problem. She's insecure, so we'll do something just for her. The counter-narratives, so the idea of the karate dojo in the classroom, was this really nice idea of it's not just doing the childcare activities at home, but also the childcare, her curriculum is open to what the children bring from home. What was interesting was often teachers will invite parents in because they need help on a field trip, or they need someone to cut things out or put labels on things. And parents really use these opportunities to volunteer as a chance to see what was going on and also to get to know the teacher. And the teachers used them as an opportunity to get to know the parents, so they were kind of informal occasions for relationship building. And there's this very strict line, the way that I'm presenting this, where there's teachers here and and educators here and mothers here, but actually it wasn't that simple. The mom who was a replacement educator, there was an educator who, with the child who had a language delay, she said that it took her a long time to build a trusting relationship with that mother, and finally she had to tell her about herself being a mom and what she experienced as a mother. So her personal experience as a mother she used that to bridge the gap and create a relationship with the parent. And one of the teachers, actually that teacher who went outside, she talked also about herself as a proxy mother at the school, and would talk about her own son, and then how she saw this daughter, her son wore glasses, this little girl wore glasses, so when the mother asked her to make sure the daughter cleans her glasses every day, she said, some of my colleagues would have been annoyed with that, but I understood from the point of view of a mother. So that was interesting. So the project, I hope I've given you a little, a little taste of it, but my goal was to build an in-depth understanding of the different participants' experience of the transition from childcare to school in marginalized neighborhoods, and to compare perspectives regarding the same children, and to understand how these meta-narratives affected their experiences and how they tell their experiences. There are lots of things we can do with this, specifically in terms of future research. The fathers, and I've tried the presentation I did. I don't know how many of you were here yesterday, but I didn't reach the fathers in yesterday's presentation. The next research project I did, I failed with the fathers too. So I'm still looking for strategies to get fathers to agree to participate in these kind of projects. The children's voices are missing, and the educators in the school-based childcare system. You don't get their perspectives. So those would be areas for future research. I was very inspired when Sally yesterday talked about the portfolios that were shared from the childcare center, and how the children and the parents and the educator would sit down and decide what was important to share with the kindergarten teacher. And so that was a beautiful example of a transition communication document that's strength-based, which we don't have clearly in Quebec, highlighting innovative transition practices, because there weren't that many in this one. Also, be interesting to look at the way that the whole special needs discourse is, two of my children were identified as having additional support needs during the project, but looking at that in more depth. And also, this was a transition from, all the children came from early childhood centers. It'd be interesting to look at children who come from private centers, from home childcare centers, or even from home. In terms of implications for practice, it would be very nice I'd love to hear what happens here. But for us in Quebec, it would be really nice to focus on transition practices that actually help develop positive relationships and communication with parents, and communications about children's strengths and interests as they start school. And my hope is that kindergarten teachers in Quebec can be inspired by what happens in the childcare sector, and perhaps take on a few of those practices in terms of daily communication and relationship building with families, despite the barriers. In terms of policy, right now Quebec is investing lots of money in creating a standardized transition evaluation, so taking that Moving On to School document and all the other ones that are similar, and putting it online and making sure that every educator fills out this thing, and then it gets sent to the school. And to me, it's a waste of money. We're also creating a website so that parents can basically diagnose and screen their children for additional support needs online, and then you get this, type in, you answer questions about your child, and then it says, oh, your child might have a problem with language or might have a problem with cognitive development, but you don't, then you can, contact your local health clinic and be put on a 2-year waiting list until you can get services, and the services are not adequate and they're not funded properly. So we have a long way to go. Perhaps there are things to learn here. And then personally, I started this and I just wanted to give voice to the families and the educators and the teachers, but in fact my role was a lot more complex than that, and my relationships with the participants developed too. And so I'm hoping to, like Nora said, use this to change practice and policy and the discourse, and it's a long and frustrating journey, so it's nice to be here and share the pain with you all. Thank you.